The debate over the future of Putnam County's Kirkpatrick Dam on the Rodman Reservoir rages on now for another year.
Every few years, in a quiet corner of north-central Florida, a river that everyone gave up for dead comes roaring back to life. State engineers crack open a dam, the water falls foot by foot, and a reservoir that sat there for half a century peels away until an entire river rises back into daylight underneath it. Drowned cypress reappear. Springs that were buried alive pour cold, clear water straight up through the limestone, as if the ground itself is breathing again. For a few short weeks, life explodes back into a place written off decades ago. Then, just as suddenly, it is gone. The river that refuses to stay dead.
The ancient waterway is the focus of a renewed battle. For the past 52 years, the Ocklawaha River has been blocked by a dam at Rodham Reservoir.
Here's the thing. This past winter, hundreds of paddlers floated out onto it, drifting through the skeletons of that flooded forest, leaning out of their kayaks to watch springs run clear after years under a brown reservoir. One of them trails a hand in the water beside a vent in the rock and feels it. Not cold, but a steady, startling 72 degrees, the same temperature it was the last time anyone saw it, decades ago. The water boils up out of the limestone, exactly where the old maps said it should, as if the river had simply been waiting for someone to let it breathe. And that is the part nobody expected. Everyone had written this river off, watched it vanish under a man-made lake in the 1960s, and assumed it was gone for good. But it wasn't. 20 springs down there had never once stopped flowing. They had just been buried alive, pouring fresh water up into the dark, waiting. Drop the lake even a little, and the whole thing comes roaring back. So, why would anyone drown a river like this in the first place? That answer starts with a canal, and a dream that took 400 years to die. How you drown a river.
The Rodman Dam, as it's better known, will survive for at least another year, at least. A plan to remove the dam fell apart in the final days of Florida's legislative session.
The lake is called the Rodman Reservoir, and it only exists because Florida once decided to cut itself in half. The plan was to carve a shipping channel straight across the state, so cargo could skip the long haul around the Keys. And this dream was old. A Spanish explorer floated the idea back in 1567. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal poured money into it in the 1930s, brought 6,000 workers into the city of Ocklawaha, then ran out of cash and left the half-dug trenches to fill with weeds. But the dream refused to die. In February of 1964, the Army Corps of Engineers finally broke ground for real. After 4 centuries of false starts, Florida was actually going to do it. And the machine they built to do it had a name. Sit with this one. They called it the Crusher, a massive rolling machine designed to flatten everything in the canal's path. And it chewed through old Florida forest like the trees were made of paper. Then they threw a dam across the Ocklawaha River, and the water behind it began to climb. When it stopped climbing, the damage was done. The dam had flooded roughly 7,500 acres of floodplain forest. It had drowned more than 20 natural springs. It had buried close to 20 miles of the Ocklawaha's original channel under a still, brown pool. A river that had run cold and clear toward the Atlantic for thousands of years was now a reservoir, and most of Florida called it progress. But here is what they did not tell the public. The canal was never supposed to stop at the Ocklawaha. It was meant to keep cutting clear across the state, and the planned route would have sliced straight into the Floridan aquifer, the drinking water for millions of people. Engineers warned it could let salt water and pollution bleed into the supply and turn it undrinkable. A project sold as a gift to commerce was quietly threatening the water under everyone's feet, and the person who finally stopped it was someone almost nobody saw coming. If a river this alive vanishing under a pointless lake is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, do me a favor and subscribe. This whole channel is about the wild places America almost lost, and the people who fought like hell to bring them back. Stay with me, because this fight is only getting started. The housewife who stopped the government. Picture a federal courtroom at the start of the 1970s. On one side, the United States Army Corps of Engineers. On the other, a woman from a small town called Mechanipe that the newspapers kept calling a simple housewife. It was a tidy headline. It was also dead wrong. Her name was Marjorie Harris Carr, and she held a master's degree in zoology. She had worked as one of the first female federal wildlife technicians in the country, and she understood the ecology of these rivers better than most of the men signing off on their destruction. Years earlier, Cornell University had refused her a place in its graduate ornithology program for one reason: she was a woman. Sit with that for a second. The person about to out-argue the federal government had once been turned away from a classroom because of her gender. Carr founded a group called Florida Defenders of the Environment and built a case that was patient, technical, and absolutely relentless. She and her allies walked into court and argued in hard scientific terms that the canal would gut the Ocklawaha and the springs that fed it. Nobody had really done that before, stopped a massive public works project with ecology instead of politics, and it worked. On January 15, 1971, a federal court granted an injunction and halted construction cold. 4 days later, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order suspending the entire Cross Florida Barge Canal. The project was barely a third finished. The crusher went silent. A so-called housewife from Micanopy had just stopped the United States government. But here is the cruel twist. Stopping the canal did not take down the dam. A dam with no purpose. It took almost 2 more decades of legal grinding before Congress officially killed the canal in 1990. The abandoned corridor became public land, and in 1998, they named it for the woman who had stopped the bulldozers, the Marjorie Harris Carr Cross Florida Greenway. Her name is on the scar now, but the dam just stayed. The crusher was gone, the canal was dead, and the Rodman Dam still stood across the Ocklawaha, holding back a reservoir for no reason anyone could explain. It had been engineered with a 50-year design life. From the day it was finished, that clock was already ticking. So why did it survive? Bass. The flooded pool had become one of the most popular bass fishing spots in the region, and a state senator named George Kirkpatrick fought tooth and nail to keep it exactly as it was. He won. A dam built for a canal that no longer existed was kept standing by politics and a fishing lake. Today it does not carry the canal it was built for. It carries his name. They call it the Kirkpatrick Dam. And for years, that was the whole fight. Fishermen against river people arguing over a lake. Then something happened out in the saltwater that changed the stakes entirely. The starving. By the 2020s, Florida's manatees were dying, and not in ones and twos. The state's surveys put their numbers somewhere between roughly 8,000 and 12,000, which sounds fine until you see what hit them. Starting in 2020, along the Atlantic coast, the seagrass they live on simply collapsed. Nearly 90% of it in the Indian River Lagoon had vanished over the previous decade, choked out by pollution and algae. The manatees had almost nothing left to eat, and they began to starve. In 2021 alone, more than 1,100 of them died, the deadliest year for the species ever recorded. And here is where it gets surreal. Picture a state biologist on a platform over the water in the dead of winter, shoveling romaine lettuce into the cold, while manatees crowd in below like cattle at a trough. Officials were so desperate they trucked in lettuce by the ton. At a single site, the program went through more than 390,000 pounds of it in one winter. Read that again. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of lettuce, just to keep a wild species from starving to death. But lettuce was never going to fix this, because the real problem is not only food, it is warmth. And that is where this dying species and that drowned river suddenly become the same story. What the river is hiding. Here's the thing about manatees. They cannot survive cold water for long. When winter hits, they crowd into whatever warm refuges they can find. And more than half of all of Florida's manatees now make it through the season by huddling in the warm water that pours out of power plants. Let that sink in. An entire species is leaning on industrial runoff to survive the winter. And those plants are aging. Over the coming decades, they will be retired or switched to cleaner energy, and that warm water will vanish. When it does, the manatees are going to need somewhere natural to go. Now, remember those paddlers from the start? That steady 72 degrees against a hand in the water? That is the answer. Those springs flow up out of the ground at a constant 72 degrees year-round, warm enough to shelter manatees through the coldest nights. And some of the finest spring habitat in the entire state is sitting right there, submerged, locked away behind the Kirkpatrick Dam. Every year, a few manatees fight their way up towards Silver Springs, squeezing through a lock that was never built for them. Scientists estimate that if the Ocklawaha were reconnected, more than 500 of them could make these lost springs their winter home. Everything they need is down there, flowing 72 degrees, waiting. There is just one thing in the way. The knot. Reconnecting the river is not a small thing. It is enormous. The Ocklawaha is one link in a 217-mile system. Silver Springs to the Ocklawaha to the St. John's, and out to the Atlantic at Jacksonville. And before 1968, water and wildlife moved through that whole length freely. Breaching the dam would send more than 150 million gallons of fresh water a day back into the St. John's. Advocates call it turning a faucet back on. It would uncover 20 drowned springs and reopen hundreds of miles of river for fish to migrate again. So, why is it still standing? Because the same dam that drowned those springs is the only thing keeping the base lake alive. And here is the part the maps do not show you. For the families who grew up fishing the Rodman Reservoir, draining it does not look like restoration. It looks like the government taking a place they love, on the word of outsiders who do not live there. There is real distrust on the ground, decades of it. But the river keeps making its own case. Every 4 or 5 years, the state drops the reservoir on purpose, from around 18 feet down to roughly 11. And for a few weeks, the whole thing nearly empties. That is exactly why those hundreds of paddlers were out there this winter, watching the old channel come back from the dead. The drawdown is the closest thing anyone has to proof, and then the gates close, the water climbs, and the river vanishes all over again. You would think watching it come back to life would settle the argument for good. It hasn't. Still standing. Governors from both parties have backed taking the dam down. In 2025, the Florida legislature finally approved money to start, and then Governor Ron DeSantis vetoed the funding, and it stalled before it began. In 2026, advocates came back with a bill demanding a real plan to remove the dam and reconnect Silver Springs to the St. John's by 2032. It cleared the full Florida House. Its companion in the Senate stalled when the session ran out before a floor vote. No final action. The river stayed exactly where it was. And the dam keeps getting older. The Kirkpatrick Dam is now 55 years old, built to last 50. It has been flagged as a high-hazard structure with a multi-million-dollar backlog of repairs, and engineers warn a failure could send tens of millions in damage downstream, with lives at risk. It costs more than $1 million a year just to keep a pointless dam standing. So that is where it sits right now. The Kirkpatrick Dam still holds. 20 springs and 20 miles of river are still drowned beneath it. The manatees still crowd around aging power plants every winter, waiting for warmth that may not be there in 30 years. And every few years, for just a few weeks, Florida lowers the water and lets everyone see exactly what is waiting underneath. A living river, springs that never stopped flowing, an entire ecosystem holding its breath. Marjorie Harris Carr once called the Ocklawaha dreamlike. She died in 1997, decades before the dam she fought ever came close to falling. So here's the question I want your answer to in the comments. When a river this alive has been waiting underwater for more than 50 years, what finally tips the balance, the species that needs it, or the people who would rather it stayed buried? Subscribe to stick with this one, because this story is not over, not even close.